Listen closely, because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is the story of survival itself. Before roads crossed the mountains, before cities reached the western horizon, there were men who lived where winter was not a season, but a judge. In a land where breath turned visible in the air, where silence was deeper than fear, and where cold could decide who lived and who never walked again. These were the mountain men, walking alone across frozen valleys, studying the wind like a living language, carrying fire in their hands and survival in their hearts. They did not fight winter. They learned how to listen to it. Because in the wilderness, cold was never just cold. It was a test. And what they understood about cold is something the modern world has slowly forgotten. Stay with this story, because the truth of survival is deeper than history itself. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. There was a time when winter was not an inconvenience. It was a verdict. In the early 19th century, when men pushed beyond the mapped edges of the young American Republic and into the vastness of the Rocky Mountains, they entered a world where cold was not a season. It was a sovereign power. These were the mountain men, trappers, traders, wanderers, many of them veterans of the War of 1812, who drifted west in search of beaver pelts and, perhaps, something harder to name. Men like Jedediah Smith, who carried a Bible into the wilderness and faced grizzlies with steady eyes. Or Jim Bridger, who could read a landscape the way others read a book. Or Hugh Glass, who, after being mauled by a bear and left for dead, crawled 200 miles across frozen ground fueled by pain, fury, and an iron will. They did not romanticize the cold. They respected it. And that is what we have forgotten. To us, cold is a setting on a thermostat. It is a forecast on a phone screen. We meet it with insulated jackets and heated seats. We speak of bad weather as though it were a personal insult. But to the mountain men, cold was a teacher, and a relentless one. They understood first what modern comfort has obscured. That cold is not merely the absence of heat, it is a force that rearranges the hierarchy of human needs. In sub-zero air, pride evaporates. Ambition shrinks, politics dissolve. What remains is elemental: breath, fire, shelter, companionship. In the high valleys of what would become Wyoming and Montana, winter could descend without mercy. Rivers froze into iron pathways, snow swallowed trails. The wind moved across open plains with nothing to blunt its fury. A man who misjudged the weather by an hour might lose his fingers. By a day, his life. So they prepared not with bravado, but with humility. They learned from native nations who had survived those winters for centuries. They adopted moccasins that flexed and insulated better than stiff boots. They wrapped themselves in layers of wool and buffalo hide. They built shelters low to the ground, respecting the way wind moves. They understood that sweat could be as deadly as snow. A soaked shirt in freezing air was a silent executioner. Cold demanded attention. It punished carelessness. It rewarded patience. And it bound men together. In summer rendezvous, gatherings along rivers where trappers exchanged pelts for powder and news, the laughter was loud and the whiskey strong. But when winter came, isolation settled like frost. A small trapping party might spend months without seeing another soul. In that silence, companionship was not a luxury, it was survival. They learned to watch one another for the first signs of frostbite, for the subtle confusion that precedes hypothermia. They shared firewood. They shared stories. They shared the unspoken understanding that in a land this cold, no man endured alone for long. We have forgotten that cold clarifies character. When the temperature drops far enough, there is no room for illusion. A boastful man who cannot build a fire is simply cold. A selfish man who hoards blankets may wake to find no one willing to stand watch while he sleeps. Winter exposes truth the way spring exposes thawed earth. The mountain men also understood something else, something we resist in our climate-controlled age, that hardship can sharpen gratitude. Imagine the first warmth of April in the high country, the river loosening its icy grip, the sound of meltwater threading through rock. After months of white silence, the sight of green was not casual. It was resurrection. Because they knew cold intimately, they felt warmth as grace. There is, too, a deeper lesson in how they regarded nature. They did not speak of conquering winter. That language came later, with railroads and barbed wire, and the confident prose of expansion. The mountain men spoke instead of enduring, of waiting, of moving when the mountains allowed passage. In time, their world changed. The beaver trade declined. Trails they once navigated by instinct became wagon roads. Settlers followed, then soldiers, then surveyors. The wilderness that had demanded reverence was measured, parceled, fenced. But winter did not disappear. It still sweeps across the plains. It still tightens its grip on the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains. What has changed is not the cold, but our posture toward it. We insulate ourselves not only from temperature, but from vulnerability. We expect immediacy. We resist discomfort. We treat inconvenience as injustice. And in doing so, we risk losing the quiet virtues winter once cultivated: patience, interdependence, foresight. The mountain men understood limits. They knew that a storm could not be negotiated with, that a frozen river would not yield to optimism. They read the sky. They listened to the wind. They accepted that survival required adaptation, not argument. There is a metaphor here, if we are willing to see it. Cold, in their world, was both danger and discipline. It stripped life to essentials and asked a simple question: what truly matters? A steady fire, a trusted friend, the wisdom to turn back when the mountain says no. We live in an age of astonishing comfort. That is no small achievement. But comfort, unexamined, can soften the very instincts that once kept us alive, not merely physically, but morally. The mountain men's winters remind us that resilience is not forged in ease. It is forged in exposure, in the long night, in the cutting wind, in the choice to rise and gather wood when every muscle pleads for rest. They understood that survival was communal, that preparation was an act of respect, that nature does not bend to willpower. And perhaps most importantly, they understood gratitude. When you have felt cold, that seeps into bone. Warmth is not assumed. It is cherished. So as we move through our own winters, literal and otherwise, it may be worth remembering those figures crossing frozen valleys under a steel gray sky. Not as caricatures of rugged individualism, but as students of the elements. As men who learned that strength without humility is brittle, that endurance without companionship is hollow, that the earth in all its severity can still be a teacher. What they understood about cold was not simply how to survive it. They understood how it could shape a soul. And in that understanding lies something we would do well to recover. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. In the high country of the Rocky Mountains, winter did not arrive gently. It descended, it claimed, it ruled. The men who moved through that vast, unbroken wilderness in the early 19th century understood this with a clarity that bordered on reverence. To them, cold was not an inconvenience to be endured with complaint. It was a sovereign force, indifferent and absolute, that set the terms of existence. Many of these men were veterans of a young republic still defining itself, some hardened by the War of 1812, others drawn west by rumor and restlessness. They crossed the Mississippi and followed the rivers upward into lands that had not yet been mapped by American surveyors. There they entered a geography where the horizon felt infinite and the sky in winter turned the color of hammered steel. Snow did not merely cover the ground, it transformed it. Trails vanished, rivers froze solid, sound carried differently across the wide expanse, as if the world itself had been muffled. Cold reorganized reality. A man might begin his journey thinking in terms of profit, beaver pelts, trade goods, the promise of independence. But once the temperature plunged below zero and the wind began to cut across open ridges, ambition gave way to something more elemental. Breath became visible, fingers numbed. The simple act of removing gloves for too long could mean permanent loss. In that climate, cold dictated the rhythm of every decision. When to rise, when to travel, when to stop and build shelter before darkness closed in. Men like Jedediah Smith learned to read the sky with the vigilance of a sailor scanning a restless sea. A subtle shift in wind could signal a coming storm. The faint halo around the sun might foretell a sudden drop in temperature. Experience was not abstract knowledge. It was memory etched in scar tissue and frostbitten skin. The mountains offered no mercy foe. Our arrogance. A trapper who dismissed a cloud bank as harmless might wake buried beneath snowdrifts, his fire extinguished, his supplies frozen solid. Cold stripped away illusion. In the settlements back east, a man's reputation could be built on rhetoric or reputation. In the winter wilderness, neither mattered. What mattered was whether he knew how to keep a fire alive through the night, whether he understood that sweat could kill as surely as ice, that damp wool against skin in sub-zero air was an invitation to hypothermia, whether he possessed the patience to build a shelter low and tight against the wind, rather than erecting something tall and proud that would collapse under the first heavy snowfall. The mountain men came to see winter not as an enemy to conquer, but as a presence to accommodate. They borrowed wisdom from native nations who had survived these climates for generations. They learned to layer clothing carefully, to use buffalo robes and carefully cured hides, to fashion moccasins that insulated while allowing flexibility. They studied how snow drifted along natural contours, how valleys trapped cold air, how pine boughs could provide insulation when laid thick against the earth. Each lesson was paid for in exposure. Cold demanded humility. It did not care about nationality, about rank, about dreams of expansion. It imposed a kind of equality more absolute than any law. The wind that swept across a frozen ridge struck every face the same way. The night that plunged temperatures far below comfort tested every camp with the same severity. In those moments, a man confronted his limits without mediation. There was no appeal to authority, no negotiation. There was only preparation or consequence. Even the animals seemed shaped by the authority of winter. Elk moved differently, conserving energy. Wolves traveled in disciplined packs, their breath rising high. Steady plumes. The mountain men observed these patterns closely. They understood that to survive cold was to enter into a kind of conversation with it, to adapt rather than resist. They moved more slowly in deep snow, rationed food carefully, and accepted that some days were meant for waiting rather than wandering. Waiting required its own discipline. In a snowbound camp, hours stretched long and silent. Wood had to be gathered before storms hit. Rifles had to be kept dry, flints protected from moisture. A neglected task could cascade into disaster. Cold had a way of magnifying small mistakes. A forgotten ember could mean a fire that failed to relight. A crack in a powder horn could render a weapon useless. Winter rewarded vigilance and punished complacency. And yet, within that severity, there was a strange clarity. The cold narrowed life to essentials: food, fire, shelter, companionship. All else receded. Men who might once have argued over trivial matters found themselves united by the shared necessity of survival. In the face of such force, cooperation was not charity, it was prudence. A shared blanket, a shared watch through the night, a shared effort to break ice along a riverbank. These acts were acknowledgments of winter's dominion. Cold also redefined time. In summer, the mountains invited movement, exploration, risk. In winter, the landscape enforced stillness. Days were measured by the angle of pale sunlight and the lengthening shadows across snowfields. Patience became a virtue not in theory but in practice. To rush in deep winter was to court disaster. To respect the pace imposed by the season was to align oneself with survival. There were moments when the authority of cold revealed itself with terrifying suddenness. A blizzard could rise without warning, erasing familiar landmarks in a matter of minutes. A river that appeared solid could conceal a T. Thin patch of ice plunging a man into water so frigid it stole breath instantly. Stories traveled among the trappers of companions lost not to dramatic battles, but to exposure, quiet deaths beneath a sky vast and indifferent. Such losses were not romantic. They were reminders. Winter demanded attention, preparation, restraint. It offered no exemptions for bravery alone. Courage without wisdom froze as quickly as fear. To live under that sovereignty was to internalize a different understanding of power. Power was not domination over the elements, it was the discipline to adapt, the foresight to prepare, the humility to acknowledge limits. The mountain men did not speak in grand philosophical terms, yet their daily choices reflected a deep recognition that nature's authority was real and that survival required respect. In the cutting wind atop a frozen pass, in the long dark of a January night when the fire burned low and the temperature fell still further, they felt the presence of that force not as metaphor but as fact. Cold shaped their movements, their relationships, their sense of self. It pared away pretense and left behind only what could endure under pressure. It reordered priorities, narrowed focus, and demanded from each man an honest accounting of his skill, his judgment, his resolve. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Survival in the high country was never an accident. It was an education. The men who pushed into the vast interior of the Rocky Mountains did not endure because they were the strongest or the most defiant. They endured because they adapted. They listened. They changed. In the beginning, many of them arrived with assumptions shaped by the settled East. Ideas about land, weather, and self-reliance forged in forests and towns that did not resemble the towering peaks and endless plains of the West. But the mountains have a way of correcting assumptions. A man who tried to impose familiar habits onto unfamiliar terrain quickly discovered how little his past experience mattered. Figures like Jedediah Smith embodied this hard-earned adaptability. Smith was deeply religious, disciplined, and determined, yet even he could not rely on conviction alone. When he crossed deserts and scaled high passes, he did so by observing the land closely, where water pooled, where grass still pushed through frost, where animal tracks converged. He adjusted routes when rivers swelled or snow fell too heavily. He learned that survival was less about pressing forward at all costs and more about knowing when to pivot. The same was true of Jim Bridger, whose knowledge of Western geography became almost legendary. Bridger did not memorize maps. He absorbed landscapes. He studied how wind carved drifts against ridgelines, how valleys funneled cold air, how certain slopes shed snow faster under winter sun. His adaptability was not theatrical, it was practical. If one trail proved impassable, he did not curse the mountain. He found another way. What set these men apart was not raw toughness, but a willingness to learn from those who had mastered the land long before them. Native nations across the West possessed generations of knowledge about surviving extreme climates. They understood migration patterns, the insulating properties of different hides, the subtle signs of changing seasons. Mountain men who dismissed this knowledge out of pride often paid dearly. Those who listened increased their odds of seeing another spring. From indigenous communities, they adopted techniques that made the difference between endurance and exposure. Moccasins allowed for quieter movement and better insulation than stiff leather boots that cracked in cold. D. Snowshoes distributed weight across deep drifts. Layered clothing trapped heat without suffocating the body. They learned to construct shelters partially below ground level to shield against wind, to line sleeping areas with pine boughs that provided insulation from frozen earth. These were not borrowed customs for the sake of novelty. They were acts of humility in the face of reality. Adaptation also meant understanding one's own body as part of the environment. In extreme cold, sweat is dangerous. A soaked shirt becomes a sheet of ice against the skin. Mountain men disciplined their pace, avoiding unnecessary exertion that would dampen clothing. They removed layers before overheating, replaced them before chills set in. They learned to read early signs of frostbite in their own fingers and in the pale skin of companions. They accepted that survival required attentiveness not just to the horizon, but to their own breathing, their own pulse. The beaver trade that drew many of them west demanded seasonal awareness. Trapping in winter could be profitable, but only if approached carefully. Rivers froze, altering access to trapping sites. Ice could support weight one day and crack the next. Adaptable trappers adjusted schedules, sometimes waiting weeks for safer conditions rather than risking everything on impatience. They rationed food stores when storms pinned them down. They dried meat carefully, protected powder from moisture, repaired gear before small flaws became fatal weaknesses. Adaptation extended beyond technique to mindset. The West did not reward rigidity. A man who clung stubbornly to a single route, a single plan, often found himself stranded. Snowstorms erased trails without apology. Floods rearranged riverbanks. Wildfires reshaped forests. The land was dynamic, and those who survived accepted that dynamism. They traveled lighter when necessary. They abandoned equipment that slowed them. They formed temporary alliances with other trapping parties when isolation became too risky. Even conflict required adaptation. Encounters with rival trappers or tense exchanges with unfamiliar groups demanded careful judgment. Survival was not only about weather, but about relationships. A flexible negotiator could avoid bloodshed and gain valuable information about terrain or resources. An inflexible one might escalate a misunderstanding into violence that weakened everyone involved. Adaptation in this sense meant reading people as carefully as mountains. The rhythm of the year dictated behavior. In summer, high passes opened and movement accelerated. In autumn, preparations intensified. Wood had to be gathered and stacked, shelters reinforced, supplies inventoried. The adaptable man anticipated winter before the first snowfall. He did not wait for crisis to dictate action. He understood that foresight was a form of respect. This was not adaptation born of weakness. It was strength expressed through restraint. The mythology of the frontier often celebrates defiance, the lone figure standing against nature. But the truth of survival in the mountains was quieter and more disciplined. The men who lasted were those who bent without breaking. They did not waste energy railing against storms. They conserved strength for tasks that mattered, building, repairing, observing. In time, adaptation reshaped identity. A man who arrived from the East with polished speech and rigid habits might, after several winters, move with the easy awareness of someone who belonged to the terrain. His clothing altered, his posture changed. His sense of time adjusted to sunrise and snowfall rather than clocks. He became less concerned with appearance and more attuned to utility. Adaptation blurred the boundary between outsider and inhabitant. There was risk in this transformation. Some mountain men grew so accustomed to the wilderness that returning to settled society felt constricting. The skills that ensured survival in remote valleys did not always translate to towns and farms. Yet that very tension underscored the depth of their adaptation. They had not merely learned techniques, they had internalized a different relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty in the mountains was constant. Weather could shift within hours. Supplies could dwindle unexpectedly. Injury could immobilize a man miles from help. Adaptability was a buffer against despair. When plans collapsed, the adaptable mind searched for alternatives. When a hunt failed, it shifted to fishing. When a camp proved unsafe, it relocated before conditions worsened. Survival became a series of adjustments rather than a single grand strategy. In that relentless environment, adaptation was not optional. It was the quiet art that separated endurance from tragedy. It required observation, humility, patience, and the courage to change course when pride urged persistence. The mountains did not reward those who tried to dominate them. They yielded reluctantly. To those who learned their contours, who moved in rhythm with shifting seasons, who understood that flexibility was not surrender but wisdom, who accepted that survival depended less on imposing will and more on aligning action with the demands of the land. The wilderness of the 19th century American West did not judge men by their intentions. It judged them by their endurance. In the frozen corridors of the Rocky Mountains, personality meant little when the temperature fell and the wind carried the sharp, patient silence of winter. What remained visible in such conditions was character stripped of ornament, exposed by hardship the way winter frost reveals the hidden shape of stone beneath soil. Redship, in the world of the mountain men, functioned as a mirror that reflected truth without mercy. Many who traveled west were shaped by the aftermath of conflicts such as the War of 1812, carrying with them not only physical experience, but emotional scars and restless ambition. Some sought fortune in the beaver trade, others sought independence from crowded settlements, and some simply felt drawn toward horizons where identity could be rebuilt away from social judgment. Men like Hugh Glass became symbols of how hardship reveals inner structure. Glass's survival after a brutal bear attack and abandonment by companions became part of frontier legend. What mattered most in that story was not the violence he endured, but the response he chose afterward. Crawling across wilderness terrain for roughly 200 miles toward survival was not an act of physical strength alone. It was a declaration that the human will, when anchored by purpose, can move even when the body's broken. Hardship stripped away social performance. In frontier camps, titles meant little. Wealth could not guarantee warmth. Reputation offered no protection against frostbite. The man who spoke loudly about bravery during summer trading gatherings along western rivers might discover, in the long silence of winter, that courage was not measured in words but in actions taken when no one was watching. Winter revealed leadership in subtle ways. A true leader was not necessarily the man who dominated conversation around the fire, but the one who rose quietly before dawn to check the horses, replenish wood supplies, or ensure that the fire would not die overnight. Leadership in the mountain world was practical rather than ceremonial. Authority emerged naturally when others recognized competence under pressure. Hardship also stripped away illusions about independence. Frontier mythology, sometimes celebra, test the solitary hero, the man standing alone against nature. The lived reality was more complex. In isolated trapping parties, survival required mutual vigilance. A man suffering early symptoms of hypothermia might not recognize his own confusion. Companions were responsible for observing behavioral changes, slurred speech, delayed responses, wandering focus that signaled danger. Pride had to yield to community awareness. The mountain men learned that character was revealed most clearly during moments of exhaustion. When food supplies were low, when storms trapped camps for days, when hunting failed and silence pressed heavily against survival, men revealed their inner architecture. Some responded with patience, others with anger. Some maintained discipline even when comfort disappeared. Those differences determined who lived to see spring. Winter punished impulsive decisions. Travel during heavy snowfall required careful judgment. Trails across open country could disappear beneath drifting snow, particularly in regions that would later become known as Wyoming. A moment of impatience could lead a traveler away from shelter into disorientation, where landmarks vanished and direction became uncertain. Many lives were lost not in dramatic combat, but in quiet exposure to cold that advanced slowly and inexorably. The psychological impact of hardship was equally significant. Isolation reshaped the human mind. Extended periods without social contact forced men to confront internal fears and doubts they might otherwise avoid. The wilderness offered no distraction. There were no crowded streets, no conversation to hide behind, no social theater. A man met himself directly. Yet hardship also cultivated resilience. Those who endured repeated winter seasons developed emotional stability under pressure. They learned that panic consumed energy needed for survival. Calm, observe it. Ion measured response, and acceptance of temporary suffering became survival strategies as important as firearms or trapping equipment. The mountain men developed a moral philosophy shaped by experience rather than formal education. Hardship taught them that arrogance invited danger. A man who believed himself invulnerable to cold might remove gloves to perform a task quickly and suffer permanent injury. A hunter who ignored fatigue might miss warning signs of approaching storm systems. Pride in that environment was not strength. It was vulnerability disguised as confidence. Stories circulated among trapping communities about companions who underestimated winter. Some tried to maintain the appearance of toughness by refusing additional clothing or shelter. Others attempted risky travel to preserve reputation. The wilderness responded to such behavior with impartial severity. Nature did not negotiate with ego. Hardship also deepened appreciation for small comforts. The first spark of fire after hours of wind-driven darkness carried emotional weight beyond physical warmth. Warm food after days of preserved meat felt restorative in ways modern convenience sometimes dulls. The sound of water melting near a fire's edge during spring thaw symbolized survival itself. Companionship became more meaningful under hardship. Shared silence around a winter fire could communicate trust more profoundly than speech. Men who trusted one another slept closer to shared heat sources, rotated watch duties, and accepted mutual responsibility. Survival was understood as a collective outcome rather than individual triumph. The mountain environment also taught that hardship was not permanent. Seasons changed. Snow eventually yielded to sunlight. Rivers once frozen began to move again through valleys of the western landscape. The return of spring was not celebrated casually, it was expected. Rionced with emotional intensity because it represented survival confirmed. Hardship refined judgment. After surviving multiple winters in the high country, experienced trappers could estimate weather changes by observing cloud formations, wind direction, and animal behavior. Knowledge was not stored in written manuals, but in memory shaped by repeated exposure. The legacy of these men suggests a broader human truth. Character is not formed in comfort alone. It is tested and clarified when circumstances remove protection. The mountain men did not seek hardship for its own sake. They accepted it as the price of life lived close to nature's raw edges. Their world reminds later generations that resilience is not loud. It is often quiet, patient, and persistent. It is the decision to gather firewood before nightfall, to repair equipment before failure occurs, to listen carefully to wind moving across snowfields, and to continue moving forward even when progress is slow. In the high silence of winter mountains, hardship spoke a language that required attention. Those who listened learned endurance, humility, and the deep understanding that survival is not victory over nature, but harmony with its demands. Life in the frontier wilderness was never built on isolation alone. It was built on dependence, quiet, practical, and deeply human dependence that revealed itself most clearly when the land turned cold. In the trapping camps scattered across the vast expanse of the Rocky Mountains, survival was rarely a solo achievement. The myth of the lone mountain man often hides a more fundamental truth. No man endured winter alone for long. Fire, shelter, vigilance, and hope were shared responsibilities. The trapping parties that traveled through Western territories during the early 19th century were small communities shaped by necessity. Many of the men who participated in the Western fur economy were shaped by experiences connected to the aftermath of conflicts such as the War of 1812, which pushed veterans and restless young men toward the expanding frontier. They carried with them skills of endurance, discipline, and survival. But those skills had little meaning without cooperation. Isolation in winter wilderness was not romantic solitude. It was a condition that demanded mutual awareness. When snowstorms trapped camps for days, sometimes weeks, every member of the group became responsible for the other's survival. Fire was the center of life. Without it, food could not be cooked, water could not be safely melted, and body temperature could not be sustained. The task of maintaining fire was not assigned casually. Someone always watched the flames when others slept. This shared vigilance was especially important in extreme cold because human judgment weakens under exposure. Symptoms of hypothermia include confusion, lethargy, and poor decision-making. Mountain men learned to observe one another carefully. A companion who spoke less than usual, moved slowly, or displayed unusual silence might be at risk. Intervention was not considered interference, but survival duty. Figures like Jim Bridger became associated with knowledge of Western geography, but his reputation was not built solely on personal skill. It was built on his ability to guide groups safely through dangerous terrain. Bridger's understanding of river systems, mountain passes, and seasonal weather patterns helped trapping parties avoid areas where winter winds intensified or where snow accumulation created dangerous travel conditions. Shared labor was another foundation of community survival. Wood gathering, animal skin preparation, weapon maintenance, and camp reinforcement were distributed tasks. No man was considered too strong to contribute, even the most experienced. Trappers participated in basic work because survival depended on redundancy. If one man became injured, others had to continue operations without disruption. Companionship also carried emotional significance in environments where loneliness could become dangerous. Extended silence during winter camps could produce psychological strain. Stories were shared around fires not only for entertainment but to preserve morale. Memories of distant homes, childhood experiences, and previous travels were spoken softly against the background sound of burning wood and wind moving across frozen landscapes. The experiences of individuals such as Jedediah Smith illustrate how community knowledge strengthens survival chances. Smith's journeys across Western territories demonstrated respect for guidance from indigenous communities who possessed generations of environmental understanding. Trade relationships and cultural exchanges were often practical as well as social. Learning from Native American survival practices improved trapping party resilience during severe winter seasons. Shelter construction was also a collective responsibility. Wind direction mattered when selecting camp locations. Camps were often placed near natural wind barriers such as rock formations or dense tree lines. Snow was sometimes used intentionally as insulation because compacted snow can reduce heat loss. Sleeping arrangements were organized to maximize shared body warmth. Men sometimes slept close enough that body heat could circulate beneath layered hides and blankets. Watch rotation during night hours was essential. Fire must not die. Horses required observation because sudden storms could cause panic and injury among animals essential for travel and transportation. Weapons were kept within reach in case of wildlife encounters. Grizzly bears, wolves, and other predators occasionally approached Camp Stew. During food scarcity periods, the wilderness also taught moral lessons about trust. Food storage was often communal rather than individual because hoarding could create deadly vulnerability. If one man hid supplies while others starved, group survival became impossible. Reputation mattered. A man known to share resources was more likely to receive assistance when he was weak or injured. The concept of community extended beyond human companionship. Mountain men developed respectful relationships with the natural environment. They avoided unnecessary killing of animals, recognizing that overhunting could reduce future food availability. Trapping was often conducted with awareness of seasonal population cycles. Winter travel itself required cooperative movement. Deep snow increased energy expenditure dramatically. Traveling alone through snowfields could lead to exhaustion and disorientation. Groups moved together, sometimes following a single path to reduce effort. Leadership during travel was fluid. The man with better terrain knowledge might lead for a time, then yield position when conditions changed. In remote valleys that would later become part of Wyoming, survival sometimes depended on helping strangers. Trappers encountering other parties during winter storms often shared firewood or temporary shelter. This behavior was not purely moral, it was practical. Tomorrow's enemy weather could trap anyone. The mountain world punished selfishness quickly. If a man refused to participate in group labor or ignored warnings about frostbite, consequences followed without mercy. Community vigilance functioned as a social safety mechanism. Peer observation reduced fatal mistakes. Stories of survival were often remembered as group achievements rather than individual victories. Even legendary figures survived because someone repaired equipment, someone maintained fire, somehow. Nay watched the horizon during storms. The frontier was shaped by cooperation hidden beneath the narrative of independence. In winter camps, human voices became important psychological anchors. The simple act of speaking to another person reduced fear responses associated with darkness and isolation. Silence was necessary for hunting but dangerous when prolonged. The mountain men understood something modern society sometimes forgets. Independence and community are not opposites. True resilience requires both. A man must be capable of acting alone when necessary, but survival in extreme environments requires connection, trust, and shared responsibility. Their legacy suggests that human strength is rarely purely individual. It is distributed across relationships, knowledge transfer, and collective vigilance. Winter did not care about personal pride. It cared only about preparation, cooperation, and endurance maintained together across long nights beneath the vast sky of the western wilderness. The return of spring in the western wilderness was never treated as an ordinary change of weather. For the men who spent long months trapped in the cold silence of the high country of the Rocky Mountains, the first signs of thaw carried emotional and spiritual weight that modern life rarely understands. Spring was not simply a season. It was confirmation that survival had been achieved once more, that winter's authority had loosened its grip, and that life itself had chosen continuation over stillness. After the harsh months of cold endured by mountain men like Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger, spring appeared slowly, almost cautiously, as if the land itself was unsure whether warmth should be trusted. Snow did not vanish suddenly. Instead, sunlight began to soften its surface during daylight hours, while nights still held the memory of winter's breath. Rivers that had been locked in ice for months started moving again beneath cracked white surfaces. The sound of flowing water returning to valleys carried psychological relief because it signaled that movement, hunting, and travel would soon become possible. Spring represented renewal after survival. During winter, life narrowed to preservation. Energy was spent keeping fire alive, maintaining shelter, and preventing exposure. When spring approached, attention shifted toward restoration and preparation for future cycles. Trappers checked equipment that had been stored during cold months. Weapons were cleaned of moisture and rust. Trapping lines were planned for beaver populations that became more active as water reopened across western river systems. The transformation of the landscape during thaw was dramatic. Frozen earth gradually softened. Green shoots began pushing through soil that had been compressed under snow weight. Animals that had moved slowly during winter became more active. Deer and elk migrated across valleys, searching for food sources that reemerged after months of dormancy. The mountain men understood that hunting opportunities improved during this period, but they also knew that wildlife was recovering energy lost during winter scarcity. Spring also brought renewed interaction between trapping communities and native nations who had survived winter using knowledge passed across generations. Trade relationships resumed along river corridors and gathering sites. Cultural exchanges were common near regions that would later become known as Wyoming. These interactions were not merely economic, they reflected practical survival networks built across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The psychological atmosphere of spring camps was noticeably different from winter silence. Voices became more frequent. Laughter returned slowly. Stories were told about past winters survived above. UT storms avoided, about companions remembered. The act of surviving winter together created bonds that were renewed each spring. Men looked at one another not with competition, but with shared recognition of endurance. Spring labor was intense because it prepared groups for future hardship. Horses required care after months of restricted movement. Fur pelts collected during winter trapping were cleaned, sorted, and prepared for trade markets. Supplies were inventoried carefully. The mountain men understood that prosperity during warmer months had to be converted into security for the next winter cycle. Water management became crucial because melting snow increased river volume. Crossing rivers required caution. Ice breakup could produce dangerous floating fragments capable of damaging equipment or injuring animals. Experienced trappers observed river behavior before attempting crossings. They studied flow speed, ice thickness, and bank stability. The natural world during spring displayed a quiet celebration of life. Bird migration patterns returned across mountain valleys. Plant life revived slowly but visibly. The mountain men often experienced spring not as comfort but as relief. Relief carries emotional complexity because it follows prolonged tension. The human nervous system, after months of cold vigilance, gradually relaxed. Yet spring also reminded frontier communities that survival was cyclical. The end of winter was not the end of challenge, it was the beginning of preparation for future seasons. Experienced trappers did not celebrate spring with reckless abandonment. They celebrated with practical optimism. Trails were mapped. Hunting territories were reconsidered. Equipment was repaired. The relationship between mountain men and the natural world during spring reflected respect rather than domination. They did not attempt to force early movement across unstable terrain. They waited for soil strength to return. They allowed rivers to settle after flooding peaks. Patience remained a survival skill even when weather improved. Stories from frontier history often emphasize bravery during winter storms, but spring survival required different forms of discipline. Complacency was dangerous because improved weather could create false security. Sudden mountain storms could still occur. Night temperatures could drop unexpectedly at higher elevations. The mountain men carried forward lessons learned during winter: humility before environmental forces, preparation before action, and gratitude for temporary safety. The transition from winter to spring symbolized more than ecological change. It symbolized human resilience across time. The memory of winter hardships also influenced behavior during spring gatherings. Food sharing became common. Trading became more active. Community celebrations were modest rather than extravagant because survival awareness remained present. Travel increased as mountain passes gradually became accessible. Movement connected remote trapping camps with trading centers that would later develop into settlements across western territories of the United States. The expansion of movement during spring contributed to economic and cultural exchange. Spring nights in the mountains held a unique emotional quality. The air was no longer violently cold, but it retained clarity. Fires burned differently during this season, less for survival, more for companionship. People sat longer near flames, speaking quietly while listening to rivers moving through valleys. The mountain men understood spring as a promise rather than completion. Winter test. D. Endurance. Spring confirmed survival but did not guarantee future safety. The cycle of winter hardship followed by spring renewal shaped frontier philosophy. Strength was not measured only in moments of victory, but in the ability to endure long periods of uncertainty and emerge capable of continuing life's journey. The return of spring was for those men who walked the high country of the Rocky Mountains a reminder that survival is not defined by single battles against nature, but by the quiet persistence required to move through seasons, through hardship, and through time itself while carrying hope that life will continue beyond winter's long silence. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.